I think most people were expecting to have a rainy, windy day at worst. As the tides began to shift inland, the little rivers of water began running up the streets towards the center of town. Actually, from most accounts that I've read, children were out playing in the water, and the waves became higher and higher and pushed further and further inland.
This wall of debris was filled with pieces of houses, furniture, pianos, pots, pans, cats, dogs, and people.
When you think of historic storms, I'm sure many come to mind. There was Hurricane Katrina in 2005 that killed over 1,000 people and brought New Orleans to its knees with 28-foot storm surge pounding the Gulf Coast. There was also Hurricane Harvey, which tied Hurricane Katrina as the costliest hurricane in U.S. history and flooded the city of Houston with the most rainfall recorded in a tropical cyclone to hit America. But what if I told you that this wasn't Southeast Texas's first time dealing with a cataclysmic disaster at this scale? And what if I told you that there was an even worse hurricane to hit that region? The 1900 Galveston hurricane was an apocalyptic disaster that would go on to become the worst natural disaster in U.S. history, with an estimated 8,000 to 12,000 people killed in the storm. Considering that this was 125 years ago in an era unrecognizable today, with limited knowledge in meteorology, and the fastest way to communicate was via telegraph, you might think that this was a storm no one saw coming, and you are partially correct. But even with the limited technology we had back then, there was still so many chances to warn the people of the bustling city of Galveston, Texas. Between Cuban forecasters and sightings from several steamships, there was still time to avoid disaster. However, due to a combination of hubris and unforeseen circumstances, Galveston was left in the dark, facing the full wrath of a Category 4 hurricane. The city of Galveston was founded in 1839, and by the 1890s, it was a highly successful port and tourist attraction that got the nickname the Wall Street of the West. It was a city composed of 37,000 residents at that time and was the fourth largest city in Texas. However, a rivalry had sparked between this bustling city and a town up the bayou called Houston that heated up when Galveston was hit by the 1886 Indianola hurricane and suffered heavy damage. The proposal to build a seawall was presented to the Galveston City Council, but the motion failed as several believed it was impossible for a wave to destroy Galveston. One of those was a well-regarded meteorologist at the time named Isaac Klein, who in 1891 wrote an article in the Galveston Daily News that the idea of a massive wave was, quote, a crazy idea. This is because the waters on the continental shelf in the Gulf of Mexico were very shallow, and Klein did not believe that the water was deep enough to produce a high enough storm surge in the Gulf of Mexico. His article was instrumental in defeating the seawall proposition despite numerous pleas from the residents of Galveston. Klein's confidence in the matter would soon be put to the test as events elsewhere were unfolding. In 1898, the Spanish-American War was underway, with the American forces landing and seizing Cuba from the collapsing Spanish Empire. The conclusion of this war resulted in a realignment in the balance of power, both politically and meteorologically, as the United States Weather Bureau started to construct outposts in Cuba for weather forecasting purposes. That on its own doesn't sound controversial, as it's just a weather agency putting outposts to help better understand their weather forecasts and warn people that bad weather is on the way. But there is one thing that I left out that will be critical down the road. Ever since the late 1500s, the Cubans had been pioneering the art of forecasting, and by the late 19th century, they had a reputation for being the most accurate weather forecasters in North America. That reputation will result in them being included in the United States Weather Bureau's forecasts from 1890 until after the United States occupied Cuba. Because of the new American outposts, they felt that the Cubans weren't needed for forecasting, as they now had people that would make, quote, more scientific readings, and they began to suppress Cuban forecasts from the papers around that time. but the Cubans had far more experience forecasting than the Americans, who had just recently begun to do it for themselves, and that experience would be invaluable very soon. Sometime in mid to late August 1900, a tropical wave emerged off the coast of Africa and began to slowly make its way across the Atlantic Ocean. The wave's initial development appeared to be rather slow, as by August 27th, it was either a tropical depression or a weak tropical storm about 1,000 miles east of the Lesser Antilles. On August 27th, a ship came across the developing storm, and while it was not anywhere near the center of circulation, the fact that there was a chance encounter with the system was valuable. The captain recorded winds between 13 and 18 miles per hour, and his barometer read the equivalent of 1025 millibars. Overall, this was not a strong storm, but estimates have the storm around 40 miles per hour at this point in its life cycle. The next day, another ship came across the storm 300 miles west, with indications that the storm had strengthened to some degree, as the captain estimated winds of 26 to 31 miles per hour and a falling barometer as it moved through the storm. While it is unclear what the exact wind speed was at that time, it is estimated that it was somewhere between 40 and 50 miles per hour. The Weather Bureau would become aware of the storm's existence on August 30th and would attempt to forecast the storm. On August 31st, the storm either made landfall or passed very close to Antigua in the Leeward Islands and entered the Caribbean Sea. The storm would slowly progress through the Greater Antilles, with the storm first passing 100 to 150 miles south of Puerto Rico. But some of the outer bands were large enough to produce heavy rainfall on the island and result in some flash flooding. The storm then made landfall near Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic and would traverse through Hispaniola, resulting in large amounts of flash flooding across the mountainous island. The storm would exit Haiti and make landfall on September 3rd in the Santiago de Cuba region of Cuba. Both Cuba and Jamaica would receive massive amounts of rainfall, as the city of Santiago de Cuba recorded 12.88 inches of rain that fell in a span of 24 hours, resulting in heavy flash flooding across the area. In some neighborhoods of Santiago de Cuba, it is reported that the floodwaters were as high as 5 feet and washed away everything in their path. Jamaica saw heavy flooding that resulted in the destruction of Jamaica's agriculture sector and cost the British government hundreds of thousands of pounds in lost revenue. However, as the storm was crossing over Cuba, the big question now was, where will this impact in the United States? In what can be described as the biggest meteorological error in U.S. history, the Weather Bureau forecasted that the storm would curve north and impact Florida and the East Coast. However, Cuban forecasters did not agree with this forecast, as through surface observations, such as wind direction and cloud direction, they were able to deduce the storm was not curving north. Cuban forecasters, who had much more experience than their American counterparts, predicted that the storm was going to continue to move west, enter the Gulf of Mexico, and rapidly intensify into a full-blown hurricane. One particular Cuban forecaster was Father Lorenzo Ganguait, who directed the Belen Observatory in Havana, noted several observations that would back up this forecast. The first was a very large and persistent halo around the moon, which is an optical illusion caused predominantly by ice crystals in the upper troposphere. The second was a dark red sky the next morning on September 6th, as the storm moved off the island. The last and probably biggest observation was that the cirrus clouds above him were moving northward, indicating that no, the storm was not headed north towards Florida, but headed westward, towards the Gulf of Mexico. He could also deduce that the storm was strengthening, although at the time, he believed the storm was not a hurricane, but a tropical storm with wind speeds around 60 miles per hour. Either way, the clock was ticking, and time was starting to run out for the people of Galveston. Even though the Weather Bureau was censoring Cuban reports and now believed the storm would curve back east and hit Florida, there was still time. On September 5th, the storm entered the Gulf of Mexico, and the observation site at Key West began to get hammered by the storm. Although this time it wasn't a direct hit, it was merely the outer bands that were hitting the Keys, and in the afternoon, wind gusts of 45 miles per hour were recorded. In the evening, Key West got a pressure reading of 996 millibars. Even though the observation site was not in the core, this indicated that the tropical storm that had just left Cuba likely became a hurricane. Even still, the Weather Bureau believed that it would curve back to Florida, but this was obviously not the case. The reason it wasn't the case was because there was a high-pressure system blocking this from moving back to Florida. There was a high-pressure system north of the Florida Keys that was pushing it to the west. So instead of the storm curving back east towards the Florida Peninsula, it was now curving to the west-northwest and deeper into the Gulf of Mexico. As a consequence of this, the storm would continue to rapidly intensify as it moved closer to Galveston, with no one knowing it was coming. Also on September 5th, the steamship Louisiana departed New Orleans bound for New York City, and because no warnings were issued in the Gulf at that time, Louisiana was completely unaware of what was in front of them. Throughout the evening, Captain T.P. Hasley noticed a steady drop in pressure as he unknowingly got closer to the hurricane. The next morning, on September 6th, he reported rapidly deteriorating conditions with a massive increase in wind. By that afternoon, wind gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour on the ship, and barometric pressure was recorded at 965 millibars, which would have likely made the storm either a Category 2 or Category 3 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale as Louisiana continued to battle the wind and waves. The steamer suffered minor damage, and instead of heading back to port, they continued their journey to New York. However, even with this encounter and a rapidly intensifying hurricane coming towards Galveston, there was still one final chance to warn them. At 7 a.m. on September 7th, the steamship Pensacola departed Galveston with no storm warning for the Gulf Coast. Captain Simmons, who commanded the Pensacola, crossed the Bolivar Strait, not knowing that 30 minutes later, the Weather Bureau finally issued a storm warning for the Gulf Coast, including Galveston, as Isaac Klein raised the red flag indicating the warning. Shortly after leaving Galveston, Pensacola encountered heavy seas and gusts. Captain Simmons, seeing this, still had time to return to Galveston and warn the people that there was really bad weather coming, but Captain Simmons never did, and why he chose not to will never be known. He stayed the course for Pensacola, Florida, but it wouldn't be long before the steamship was facing the brunt of the hurricane. After an afternoon of fighting the winds of over 100 miles per hour and facing extremely high surf, Captain Simmons ordered the engine stopped and the anchor dropped, preparing to ride out the storm. However, the next morning, the anchor chain snapped and Pensacola was at the mercy of the hurricane. The lowest pressure recorded by Pensacola was 965 millibars, but the steamship was never in the eye. Galveston was never fully warned, and the forecasters were unaware of the impending disaster headed their way. Midday on September 7th, large waves began to crash near the Galveston shore as the tide began to go inward. By the afternoon, it was already 4.5 feet above normal and still going up. Rain began to fall around midnight on September 8th at a light and steady rate that would continue all night. At 4 a.m., Isaac Klein's brother, Joseph, who worked with him and lived with his family, woke up to an apparent sense of doom. He opened his window to the backyard of Isaac's house and saw that it was flooded in several inches deep of water. Alarmed by this, Joseph wakes up Isaac, and after seeing the floodwaters, the pair went to the Levy building where they worked and noticed that the barometric pressure had only fallen slightly, and the wind was blowing from the north. This normally would push the tide outward, but because of the approaching hurricane and storm tide, this had no effect. By the time the morning came around, there was already little rivers of water flowing through the streets of Galveston due to rain and in increasing amounts, storm surge. There was initial celebration as this ended a heat wave that had plagued Galveston for several days, and there are accounts of people playing in the rain and having fun. However, this festive environment was short-lived, as the great bathhouses that were located on the beach were getting ripped apart by the storm surge. It quickly became apparent that this was a full-blown hurricane approaching Galveston, but still, no one knew how devastating it would be. By mid-afternoon, the storm surge was across the island and floodwaters were waist-deep in downtown Galveston. the Levy building recorded a 2-minute sustained wind of 102 miles per hour before the anemometer was blown away. At 7:30 p.m., the water in Galveston rose 4 feet in 4 seconds, and the eyeball came ashore. Galveston would be completely decimated in the next few hours, with almost all the city flooded with storm surge, and there was a massive wall of debris piling up as it got closer and closer to the city center. Life is full of irony, as because there was so much debris piled up and jammed between the buildings that still stood, it created the one thing Galveston needed all along: a seawall. This is what saved the downtown portion of the city from absolute destruction. But even so, the damage was already done. The damage in Galveston was apocalyptic, with entire neighborhoods and blocks wiped out. Many returned to homes that were completely decimated by the hurricane, and the prosperous Wall Street of the West turned to ruin within 24 hours. The 1900 Galveston hurricane would ultimately peak at an estimated 145 miles per hour, making this a Category 4 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale. The storm would weaken slightly as it would come ashore due to the land interaction, and it would make landfall at an estimated 140 miles per hour, making this one of the strongest landfalling hurricanes in Texas history. The storm weakened dramatically due to land interaction and became a tropical storm over central Texas. It would then impact Oklahoma before becoming an extratropical cyclone over the Great Plains. The storm would then impact the Midwest, causing varying levels of damage throughout the region. The city that was hardest hit was Buffalo, New York, where the upcoming Pan American Expo was greatly impacted, as the construction of it was hindered by 80-mile-per-hour winds. The storm would then exit North America in mid-September, and its last known location was near Iceland, where it most likely dissipated. The Great Galveston Hurricane would become one of the most impactful storms in U.S. history, as Galveston was completely destroyed and an estimated 8,000 to 12,000 people were killed in the hurricane. The estimated damage was at $34.5 million, which is approximately $1.25 billion in 2024. Because of this hurricane, Houston would become the dominant port city in Texas, as its location was deemed much safer than Galveston's. As a result of this catastrophic hurricane, the federal government almost immediately approved funding for a seawall for Galveston, which over the course of 2 years would be raised up 17 feet above the surface, and the seawall construction began. The initial construction was completed in 1902, but after several hurricanes ravaged Galveston's neighborhoods that weren't fully protected by the seawall, it was extended until 1963. Ever since construction, the seawall for the most part had held against any hurricane that came up to it. However, in 2008, Hurricane Ike caused significant damage to parts of Galveston due to a 20-foot storm surge that overtopped and went around the seawall, with northern Galveston getting the brunt of the damage. There are still debates to this day to extend the seawall even more than it already is, but as of now, nothing new has been added. The Great Galveston Hurricane was a disaster that changed the landscape of Southeast Texas forever, as now Houston is one of the largest cities in America, and Galveston is essentially a suburb. The insanely deadly death toll could have been avoided, even with the technology we had back in 1900. Between the Cuban forecasters' warnings and the shipping observations, there was plenty of time to evacuate the people of Galveston and prevent such a disaster. But because the Weather Bureau censored the forecasts, it resulted in thousands of people dead. The hurricane would redefine meteorology and weather forecasting forever, as now we have advanced warnings for an incoming tropical cyclone days before it hits. I am Pat's Path Predictor, and thank you for watching this documentary. If you'd like to see more, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. It helps us out and it helps us make more documentaries like these. Stay safe.